All right. Welcome to another A to Z We Need Context episode. We got the letter C in the works. We've been away for a while. We've been working on it. And now we're back with C is for Costa Rica. I'm here, Kubrick, with Meeper, and we will be going through the history of Costa Rica from its very inception as a people. So we're going to be going back to the indigenous pre-Columbian times, and we're going to try and take it all the way to the present day. And hopefully y'all enjoy it. And by the end of it, it's our hope that you will have a better understanding of this country that I think most of us just think of as a fun little tourist destination.
And this doesn't mean that the other A countries and B countries are like disregarded. We'll just get to it after we do a first rundown of A to Z. We'll go back to A, and then we'll do like another rundown with each country, like each letter having one country.
Yes, that's absolutely correct. And obviously, so next week, or next one will be the letter D.
And next week is stretch.
Next week is a stretch, yes. Anyways, so where are we starting? Tell me, what year are we starting at roughly?
I mean, we can start with like pre-Columbian times.
Yeah. So we can go all the way back to like 6,000 BC plus. And what do we have? We have mostly in this region between 6,000 BC plus all the way until the 1500s, which is the arrival of the Spanish. You have a long history of multiple different indigenous groups. The main way we can divide these is by discussing the ones that migrated from the north, the ones that migrated from the south, and the ones that have always been, let's say, in Costa Rica. Being, in the isthmus of Central America, particularly so close to Panama and Colombia, they, of course, had a lot of migration from these areas as well, especially as indigenous communities, civilizations, tribes, etc., had open travel and open trade, ranging all the way from North America to South America. So in the south of the country, we see a lot of indigenous groups that had ties to the Incans, for example, as well as the more Colombian Panamanian tribes. And we see this through, like, for example, how they count. They count using knots in rope and string. But then we have the ones that migrated from the north. This is a more later phenomenon, especially around the 1500s, where when the Spanish invaded Mexico in particular, but, the northern parts of Central America, they caused a mass migration movement where the indigenous communities fled the violence and the war and the destruction caused by the Spanish conquistadors and fled to the south. And so many of these Chorotega, as they're called, inhabit the northern regions of this country. And they are the most populous, or they were rather the most populous indigenous group in Costa Rica. And then, of course, there are the local indigenous groups as well. And these are ones that you find everywhere from literally in the San Jose metropolitan area to an island in the middle of the Gulf of Nicoya, and even Nicoya itself, the city, where it had the most populous indigenous community in the country, having roughly around 70,000 inhabitants in the 1500s. They had a very sophisticated form of government. They had rules written down. They had inheritances, and like, this person died, and so this person inherits whatever, like his children. They had all of that. They even had a system of government where they didn't have a king because he was like born as the child of another king. The kings were elected. And so they would have elections every 4 years to vote for the king. And then even beyond that, they had what's called a monexico, which is like a parliament. And the parliament was also elected every few years. And the parliament had powers above the king. The king could, in fact, the parliament could kick out the king, which they did on many occasions. And so the rulers were certainly beholden to their population. And they lived in what was called primitive communism, and resources were distributed based on need.
And an interesting thing that I found that was analyzing pollens and sediments around in Costa Rica, and they were kind of going against the narrative that the Italian explorers, let's call them, or that were in around like in 1900s, right? They basically thought that a lot of these areas that they were exploring in Costa Rica were in pristine condition, meaning that there weren't people, or if there were, they didn't really like chop down trees to create farms and to like actually do like human development. And they found that that was because that didn't exist in like the 1900s, or even like up until 1500s, and the forests had been growing for those 500 years. But if you go before that 1490 mark, and if you start looking at those that data, you can see that there was like a very significant taking significant change of the land there for human development.
Yeah. And you can even see this as well in the south of the country with the famous Osa stones, which are giant round, like perfectly round balls made of stone. Given the technology that is assumed of these indigenous tribes, people didn't understand how they could have possibly made them. Having said that, when the first colonists arrived in Costa Rica, now we're talking about like the 1500s, because Costa Rica was in fact the last country to be colonized in Central America because of the terrain and the lack of population. They found these giant stone balls, and they immediately thought, oh, there's got to be like gold inside. There's got to be like treasure inside. And they just started like drilling holes in them and sticking dynamite in these giant balls and just blowing them up all over the place. Which is, really a great way of analyzing the situation, I think.
I mean, the gold rush rush was insane.
Yeah, well, we're definitely going to talk about the gold rush coming up here, but I think that's a good background on the indigenous people, and so we can fast forward to the colonists. So they arrive and they start instituting some changes. They no longer wanted to retain the society that existed, which did exist. It wasn't, as you said, an empty land. Where they had their own currency, they had their own laws, and they arrived to impose their own laws. They would even come and tell them like, hey, they would come up to the local kings that were elected, and they would tell them, hey, you gotta tell these people to behave differently. They have to have some Christian values. The women are too promiscuous was one of the complaints. Because, in the indigenous society, prostitution was legal. If you were single, you could like fuck whoever you wanted. It wasn't a big deal. But having said that, if you were married, then they had very strong bigamy laws, where if you cheated on your partner, you would get severely punished by the state.
Oof.
Yeah, very, very, very strange. But yeah, so they tried to impose their ideals, but
And also
beyond
like the work, like when it comes to labor, it's like so different compared to like European way of labor where,
definitely.
you work like so much, like you work the fucking laborers to the bone,
Hmm.
in which they did, and like because they weren't really used to, and the cruelty that the colonists subjugated the native population was so high that they started dying, which in turn made the colonists have to do the work that they basically were extracting from the indigenous people themselves now. So they treated the indigenous population so bad that they had to end up becoming farmers in order to live.
Yeah, no, that's a really great point. That's a great segue into, I think, a big part of the history of this country, which begins in this 1500 time period, which is that the colonists who arrived in Costa Rica, which already had a sparse indigenous population, were famously, even among other colonists, considered the cruelest to
Yeah,
in all of Central America. And this is after and during the indigenous genocide that occurred both in Mexico of the Aztecs as well as the Taínos in the Caribbean. But in Costa Rica, they were even more genocidal. To reflect this, just in the few years that they were there, as you mentioned, they genocided the indigenous population so thoroughly that they ran out of labor and would have to start wars with the last remaining indigenous tribes in the country, which were primarily the Talamanca in the south. And they would have to start wars with these tribes just to get prisoners to enslave them because they did not have enough laborers. This
and even then they
cruelty,
couldn't maintain.
yeah, and even then they couldn't maintain and had to essentially establish, since the 17th century, they had to establish a settler expansionist program in the country, whereby the government said, go out into the quote unquote empty territories, very similar to the United States, in fact. Go settle out in the quote unquote empty territory, in the indigenous territory, and we will supply you, we will support you, and we will, more importantly, formalize the ownership of the land that you settle on. So, a lot of immigrants, particularly from Galicia in Spain, would come to Costa Rica and would just settle the indigenous lands, killing them as they went along with the full state sanction. And it's because of this that Costa Rica, both in the present day as well as in those times, was considered a beacon in Central America of whiteness, where the population was regarded as a superior race to the surrounding Central American nations because they were European, white, and not a mixed or indigenous population such as in Nicaragua or Panama.
Right, it's funny because like the one of the books he mentions that even as a European white they were in the better group and the better families coming from Iberia compared to other white Spaniards that went in other Central American countries. Even then, basically, they were the whitest out of all the Spaniard colonizers that came. According to, of course, Americans at that time.
Exactly. And in fact, their cruelty wasn't something that was like written about obviously by indigenous people. This is like they were reveling in their cruelty, written both by the Spanish priests who were here as well as the Americans who would arrive later. And you can really see the shocking genocide that occurred, particularly when you compare the population of the most populous city, as we mentioned, which was Nicoya with 70,000. And then you look at the population of the city of Nicoya in the 1700s, which was listed in the census, which I will take with a grain of salt, of course, because in the same time period, only land-owning white men were part of this census. But the population, albeit instead of 70,000 in the 1500s, was now 1,978. It's a very big difference.
Mm-hmm. And at first, like the land was municipal, but then since they needed the settlers to occupy the land, they were creating programs to help create like land ownership for the settlers, kind of like a Homestead Act.
That's right.
Which like you'd come and at first you'd be, you'd have to pay a small price to settle, but then, they started even to like lower that to the point that it was like it kind of became free of cost. I think in 1909, even like it became free of cost for a head of family to just settle and cultivate the land.
Yeah. I guess we'll quickly wrap up this colonial period with, at this point, the rest of the world is slowly releasing itself from the shackles of colonialism. And Costa Rica in particular is not the country that is looking for independence, because Costa Rica at this point is still part of a larger province within the Spanish Empire, which is under the control of Mexico, because the Spanish Empire had essentially two directorates within Latin America. One was Peru, which was all of South America, and then Mexico, which was all of Central America as well, all the way up to California. And at this point, Mexico, being the region that controls Costa Rica, was fighting for independence, won independence for a multitude of reasons that there's no need to get into now. And from there, the province of Central America, which Costa Rica was a subdivision within that, subdivision, they were still content, in fact, to remain a part of the Mexican Empire. The capital city of Cartago at the time and the elite that lived there wanted to stay with the Mexican Empire. They said, you know what, we don't really want to rock the boat. We want to maintain the status quo, which is something I think that is going to be a recurring theme in Costa Rican politics. Wanting to constantly maintain the status quo on behalf of the rich plantation, particularly coffee plantation owners of the country. And so eventually the Costa Ricans who want to stay lose, and they are replaced with the Costa Ricans who, like the rest of Central America, wants to leave the Mexican Empire and form their own nation state called Central America, which is a short-lived nation state, which encompassed everything from Guatemala all the way down to Costa Rica. At this point, we're now talking about the 19th century, the very beginning of the 19th century. So now we're talking about Central America. There is still no Costa Rica. There's still no Guatemala. There's still nothing. And Central America, the nation, is managed out of El Salvador and Guatemala. So anyways, during this time period, the only thing of note that I will advance are a couple of things. One is that this is the time period where one of the most important events in Costa Rican history happens, even though it was not the nation of Costa Rica yet. And this is the annexation of Nicoya. And this is where the province of Costa Rica essentially redraws the lines of the border it has with the province of Nicaragua, which are both provinces within the nation of Central America. What difference does this make? It is a important thing of note because it is the starting point for a long-running theme in Costa Rican history, which is control over the San Juan River. And control over the San Juan River will become apparent as we move forward with the story. But leave it for now that in the province of Costa Rica, they held a vote which was sent into the Central American main government, and then they voted on it, and then it was passed. They held a referendum in, as you can see, the cities of the western coast in the region that's now called Guanacaste, in the cities of Santa Cruz, Liberia, and Nicoya, which are the three main cities. And they held a referendum saying, okay, do you guys want to be part of Costa Rica or do you want to be part of Nicaragua? Important things to note here are the economic ties that existed already, because obviously resources had already begun to be extracted from this nation as well as all the nations in Central America. In Costa Rica in particular, it was coffee plantations, sugar plantations, banana plantations, and pineapple plantations. The top two were obviously banana and coffee for the history of this nation.
Coffee was top one.
Top one by a lot.
Yeah.
Banana came a little later, maybe a century later.
Yeah.
But at this point, they hold a referendum to not make the story too long, but they hold a referendum whereby the total number of votes was roughly 5,800. Keeping in mind that previously just one of these cities had 70,000 during the last indigenous census. So the population was severely culled and replaced with, as we mentioned, these superior race, in quotation marks, of course, white settlers, land-owning settlers. And they, of course, had economic ties to the main ports. As none of these cities are ports, they had ties to Punta Arenas port, which is in Costa Rica, as well as to the San Carlos port in Nicaragua. So, given those economic ties, the city most to the north, Liberia, opted to stay with the port that they most utilized in Nicaragua. And the two cities to the south opted to stay with this, the port that they most utilized, which was the port to the south of Punta Arenas. Obviously, this is disregarding the fact that this is a referendum between two provinces, as well as referendum that is discounting either a very large segment of the population, or it is a voting populace that is exclusively new white European settlers that replaced the much, much larger indigenous population that existed before. So they annexed the two cities, the two territories, let's say, of the two cities, and then a couple years later said, well, you know what, we'll just take Liberia as well, and annexed the third city that said no as well. They said, well, 2 out of 3, that's good enough. And that's where the borders began once the nation state of Central America dissolved. And that's where we start with the first mention of Costa Rica as an independent nation state.
The capital is changed from Cartago to San Jose because the families that are in Cartago wanted to join Mexican Empire, whereas the ones in San Jose wanted to stay independent, and the ones that wanted to stay independent won, and they kind of started. They moved their capital to San Jose. And also there was an interesting difference between Costa Rica and other Central American countries demographically, or you can say socially, because the majority of the people were the landowners. small landowners, but they were still landowners compared to other countries in which had just a few landowners, but they were big and much more powerful. So at first, Costa Rica kind of starts as like small landowning country, which helps with the stability initially because they kind of have the same interests, and even from an outside POV, it is clearly said that so long as order is maintained and everybody has their own land, so private property is fine, then there isn't much enthusiasm on elections, and there isn't much political fervor on doing anything in the country. And most of the politicians just end up putting their own people in power, and then just continuing as usual. Basically, status quo, not much change. And the voters know this, therefore, they don't really care about who's in power, really, unless like you have some personal benefit that you'll get immediately because you have some knowledge of who's your friend in the country, in like the government.
Yeah, a lot of the decision making from the populace, the analysis is that it's mostly based on gossip. That is how they choose the candidate to vote for.
You can see that from the number in the election in 1913. There were 64,056 votes casted, but the total population is 410,000. So it's like so low. It's like barely any. You can't really even call it an election with like that low of a percentage.
Yeah, exactly. So they become their own country, and what would you say are the leading things going on? Now we're moving into the middle of the 19th century.
I mean, one interesting thing is that one of the first people that tries to introduce a tax, I think Alfredo Gonzalez was his name, and one of the first people that tries to introduce a tax immediately land tax actually, and proportional taxation income-wise, immediately gets screwed. So you can see like a status quo loving population, which like immediately does not like getting taxed, which will be
a running theme.
A running theme, yep. And also in 1885, there is the set.
Whoa, you're getting ahead of me, but go on. Okay. No, you can wrap it up.
Yeah, but I mean, and the other big, probably one of the biggest government, how would I say, government initiatives is the setting up of free and compulsory education at that time, because Costa Rica usually just prouds itself on like having education at an early time.
Yes, absolutely. But before that, maybe 40 years before that, maybe 50 years before that, there was a lot of stuff going on. And I think it's important to set the stage. So forgive me for going on a tangent, but I promise it'll be worth it. During this time period of the early 19th century, leading up into the mid 19th century, what do we have going on in the world? On this side of the world, we have annexation of Mexico. We have the slave revolts going on in the United States. We have the United States Civil War that is a consequence of these very same slave revolts. And we have the earliest imperialist efforts of the United States at expansionism. And we see this both in their annexation of Mexico as well as their open interest in purchasing Cuba, Puerto Rico, as well as other Caribbean islands, and with the indirect, though in many ways direct funding of privateers known as filibusters in Central America. These guys were there to essentially turn Central America and the Caribbean into a colony of the United States, in particular a slave colony. In the words of William Walker himself, who was the main filibuster, he wanted to find an alternative to the black slaves in the United States who were very difficult to handle. And instead, he wanted a more subservient race to enslave, such as the indigenous population of Central America and the Caribbean. And in his own words, he says, first the indigenous, and then we'll move on to enslave the rest of the mestizos, who are the mixed indigenous with Spanish, which is the majority of the population.
It is kind of funny because it's not that the colonists didn't try to enslave the indigenous population in North America, but it just didn't work because not only they would be able to escape, and they had that feeling of escaping because they had a community nearby,
Right.
compared to shipping slaves and them being in a completely new continent without any ties, but also, dying from disease at that time. So like it was like a tried method that failed, but like he still wanted to do it for another region.
Yeah. So at the time, there were a lot of financial interest in the region. From one side, the slavery financial interest, which at this time was the boom. That was what was pumping up the American economy. They were selling cotton like crazy. And
70% of world exports.
Exactly. And they wanted to get in on more of that slave labor profit with, in particular, sugar plantations as well as banana plantations in Cuba, Nicaragua, and the rest of Central America, really. But they mention Cuba and Nicaragua particularly as their bases of operations, ironically, knowing what happened in the future. And so there is an additional financial interest as well, and this is the construction of a canal. Because at this point in time, we mentioned a lot of different things going on. Something else that was going on, the California gold rush. People wanted to get to California and they wanted to look for gold. And that means that they had to build cities in California. And that's, a reason why they were building the railroad as well. But shipping things is always an option. And at this point, the steamship companies, which as we see, was already monopolizing at this point in time, as we see the tendency of companies to do. Now it's, AT&T, but in the 1800s, it was a steamship company. The 1900s, it was a banana company. So we see how they are looking for a canal. And the most viable, before as we all know, the current Panama Canal that exists, the most viable option was through the river San Juan, the one we discussed. And this river is very important because specifically this. And the annexations that begun in the 1820s were a part of this same plan, as we see, because even in the treaty negotiations that were done for these annexations, it was always a Costa Rican representative, a Nicaraguan representative, but then also a steamship company representative was always at these treaties. Sorry.
Yeah, and the reason why the Nicaraguan canal was so much better is because it would cut the travel time by 500 miles, which is huge.
It is. So it is more north.
Yeah, so instead of going all the way to Panama and then having to go back north, you'd cut that time. So it was very, very lucrative to create the canal here instead of in Panama.
And then not just that, there's also a giant lake in the middle of that river. And so it gave you the option of having a natural port already that was big enough and deep enough to sustain maritime trade, something Panama doesn't have. They don't have a port in the middle of their country. They have a port on either side and a system of locks to get it from one side to the other, which in this case, they wouldn't have needed any of that sophisticated technology to just use this almost natural canal that existed.
Yeah, but I don't think we should spend too much time, since this is more for Nicaragua than Costa Rica.
No, for sure. I completely agree. I think the most relevant portions of this come from how Costa Rica was used in order to take more territory, as their government was more aligned with U.S. corporate interests. What do I mean by that? We mentioned the filibusters. While that is an important part of Nicaraguan history for sure, it is also an important part of Central American history, as the goal was to take over the rest of Central America. And Costa Rica in particular fought and was a large component for why the war was won against William Walker and the filibusters who were trying to create a slave colony in Central America and the Caribbean. It is a big point of pride for Costa Ricans that they were the ones who pushed back the filibusters and saved Central America. And while true that their efforts were important in stopping William Walker, it's important to understand the motivations for why these things were done. So the Costa Rican army was led by a U.S. Marine. Why was the Costa Rican army led by a U.S. Marine? Because, to not get too into the weeds, but William Walker was working on behalf of a steamship company, which was, to not get too much into too many details, were the competitors of another steamship company. And the competitor aligned himself with Costa Rica, the competitor being Cornelius Vanderbilt. And he aligned himself with the Costa Rican government against William Walker, who had stolen some of his ships. And so even in this war that was fought, what happened? The main purpose of the war, from the Costa Rican side, maybe they may have had the intention of stopping William Walker to defend themselves, but ultimately the person who was leading them, his goal was not that. His goal was to arrest William Walker, get him back to the U.S., and to recover the stolen property. That was the goal. And that is what they did as well.
Yeah, continue business as usual afterwards with the transit company.
Exactly.
Having all the assets back and having, probably creating a new decree with the country so that they can pay less taxes than before too.
Exactly. And not just that, but as a part of their directive was to push into Nicaraguan territory to, of course, help with the battles against William Walker, but also to establish control of these areas so that the steamship company, who had openly said that they wanted to build a canal there, would have, the partnership with the Costa Rican government already and the Costa Rican government's control of that region in order to then use said river for their canal purposes. And in effect, that is what happened. The Costa Rican army, after pushing across into Nicaragua and fighting there, refused to leave their positions once the war was over. They were like, no, we're good here. And these territories suspiciously were the territories along the river and the fortresses along the river. So this all culminates eventually into treaties that were signed between steamship company representatives and temporary government representatives who, didn't last more than a year. But leaving all that aside, why didn't the government representatives last long? Let's say to leave Nicaragua out of it, on the Costa Rican side, what happened to the president of Costa Rica immediately following the filibuster war?
He got cooed by the military chiefs, and after he tried to take the country back from the military, he got killed.
Yeah, he was assassinated. And the military was acting on behalf of the rich coffee plantation owners, the forever elite of this nation.
Yeah, so it starts like if at the start and even after, like you have, you still don't have like a worker class still, in which, they're landless, propertyless, and they just kind of work for a living. But you still have like some landowners, but then there start being like a clear rich, landowning class and rich capitalist class. Which
one thing I will add, since you bring up workers, there were workers, and slavery was abolished in Central America as well as the Mexican Empire, but not everyone was considered a human being in order for slavery to be abolished for all human beings and or for all citizens, let's say. Because at this point in time, there are Afro-Caribbeans who are not considered citizens and were not considered citizens until the 20th century. And so they did not have the same rights, including slavery. And the same goes for the indigenous population, who at this time, what happened to them? Well, very similar to the United States. They had, quote unquote, signed treaties whereby they would be relegated to reservations. Now, as we know in the United States, what does it mean to have indigenous people on reservations? It means that they are completely abandoned by the government, that they receive no support whatsoever from the government, that there aren't even roads that arrive to these areas, no running water, no electricity, no medical services. And on top of that, their supposed land rights that they received in exchange for, the abandonment are not even respected because they are constantly being sold off to, logging companies, pineapple companies, banana companies, and so on. And these communities continue to be abandoned and even murdered by commercial interests to this day. But going back to Porras, who is the president at the time who was assassinated, we then can fast forward to the 20th century.
Yeah, and also I wanted to say, like,
Yeah.
there was like in the end of 19th, start of 20th, there were workers, and they were like starting to organize themselves into like voting for their interests.
Yes.
But every time they would try like to put something of like a party and try to like create, they would just not really have like, even if they elected them, they wouldn't do anything that they wanted. So like it would just be ineffectual even if they won.
Yeah.
Like it was, they still didn't, like, it's kind of like not having concrete political power. Like even, you can argue that's what it is in USA to this day,
Yeah. In many ways, it is very similar to the United States.
Yeah, like you can put the Democrats in power, but do you really like, are they really gonna do things to help you? Like, you can put them in power, they can have their positions in government, and then there just won't be a change. So did it really matter?
Exactly. And so before we get to the 40s, I think there's a big thing we should talk about, and that's the United Fruit Company. What do you know about this? What do you know about this company? Does it still exist?
I mean, it exists, and it's like it's taken many different names because obviously you need that to like dodge certain legislation.
Yeah.
So
What do we know it by now? What's the main name?
isn't it Chiquita?
That's right. Chiquita banana, which means
Yeah.
little banana.
Yeah.
Little banana. Like a small bean
So
banana.
the basically USA starts by like early 1900s. USA starts becoming like a huge consumer of bananas.
Huge.
So yes, and the countries, basically, since they have so much trade with America, of course American companies will see that as a lucrative deal. And also I think the creator of the United Fruit Company also owned a lot of the transport already, like the transport system in Costa Rica. So
Of course.
he was in the best shape. I think his last name was Keith, I think, and he was in the best position to create a good banana company that would be completely outcompete the domestic ones.
And at this point, when we talk about like the banana company operating here, we need to understand how it worked then, and to a certain degree still now, but specifically with regards to economic enclaves, where it was basically they controlled the plantation and they had like a little town within the plantation where everybody lived, all the housing, all the food, everyone was basically paid, and then you had to go buy shit at the
Company
company
town.
store in the company town. Exactly.
Yep, yep,
And
yep.
then they also owned the port, and they would make like a road from the company town to the port, and the port was also like a company town essentially as
Or the
well.
railroad,
Yes, or
like a
the
railroad
railroad.
station.
And that's in fact the first railroads in the country. Both Limon to Quepos was for the banana company, as well as Nicoya to Punta Arenas was also for the very early coffee enclaves that existed.
So at first, if you're a country whose a corporation whose goal is to capture a country, at first, what do? You go into that country and you promise that you'll do investment because obviously Costa Rica isn't very rich at that time, and any investment into the country would be appreciated because obviously they don't know your long-term plan. And then you capture the infrastructure. Because if you capture the infrastructure, you can immediately destroy any competitor. For example, if you have, if and it would even be very easy for an infrastructure company to, change itself into a banana exporting company, right? Because
Yeah,
if you own the, yeah, you own the infrastructure. If a banana company tries to enter Costa Rica, you can immediately put high prices on it, and then you make it unfeasible for them to operate. On the other side, now you can just create your own banana plantations and your own program so that you succeed. So that was colonialism 101. How do you capture a country, get the infrastructure, get rid of the competition after that, and then just start creating your own capital that's for bananas in this regard.
yeah. And beyond the capturing of the country, they also were brutal, to put it lightly. They funded militias to kill people. They would routinely kill their workers. Their workers worked in slave conditions, particularly because they operated in the south of the country, which is the south and the coasts, which is where the Afro-Caribbean population and the indigenous population primarily live. They kept these already marginalized groups in a further state of enslavement.
Yeah, and not to mention the complete disregard for environmental issues, in which that's one of the biggest
To this
things
day.
of having, yeah, but even of having a transnational company in your country, they are not going to be living with the consequences of their actions because they can very easily just pack their bags and go back to, right.
Yeah.
The headquarters aren't in your country. The main things aren't in your country. They're not going to be living with the consequence. So what they did was basically, if they had problematic lands in which, for example, low soil nutrients, etc., in which they kind of destroyed the land, they would just move on. Like they didn't care to like rehabilitate it and like try to be sustainable, because why bother? You go from this, go back to maybe try another country after the whole land is destroyed in Costa
And
Rica.
they did, in fact, they did it in Guatemala, Salvador, everywhere. And you can see it to this day because, and you can look this up, the country that uses most pesticides on the planet is Costa Rica, the number one pesticide user.
Yeah, and also all the railroads, all that infrastructure is going to be destroyed as soon as they leave because it won't be maintained. Obviously,
And
the
it was.
country, yeah. So obviously the country doesn't have the strength to maintain that, so it will be destroyed. That too, and an interesting thing that they did was in order to go from the Atlantic to the Pacific to try to get new areas to cultivate bananas, they tried to capture these properties using other companies. For example, Gulf of Dulce Land Company or the Chiriqui Land Company were used by the United Fruit Company to purchase them. But since you do it with these third parties, you can evade any regulations that are in the United States.
Oh yeah,
So
they were. It's so funny how you see the same things happening nowadays with like shell corporations and all this shit. And they were doing this back then. They were, they were creating sub corporations with all sorts of stupid names, like generic sounding AI names, and they were, doing their shit. And
yeah,
then they
yeah,
would go, "Oh, what do you mean? We're a totally different company."
yeah, we're totally different. Like our partners do the slavery. We don't do the slavery, but like you obviously know that the
Nestle.
slavery is there. Yeah, like Nestle, like you obviously know the slavery is there, and you're fine with it because you have created the situation for there to be slavery.
Exactly.
But you can just wash your hands clean because they say, "Oh, no, it's some company in the country itself.
Yeah,
It's not our."
you know how these Ivory Coast people are. They just love
Yeah,
slavery.
yeah. But
um,
that wouldn't exist without there having been a market for cocoa, or in this case, coffee, banana.
banana, pineapple, etc.
And also, an interesting thing is that every time the United Fruit Company got in like an area, the individual crop, farmers and producers of banana liked it. Because, and it feels like they just made the same mistake. Like every time they liked it at the start, and then as soon as it
I mean, they
happened,
were all hogs.
yeah, like completely not knowing the person that you just invited in the area, because immediately after you create a monopoly in 1942, only 6%, 6.08% to be accurate, of the lands where bananas were cultivated in quepos still belonged to independent producers. Everything else was the United Fruit Company.
The original UFC.
Yeah, because in 1942 it's still.
So we're at 1942. So something else interesting happened in the 40s, right?
I mean, I just wanted to say that, like, at first, when the company towns were created, it was like such a clear racialized town in which you had the American or white zone, and this was for the high-ranking officials of the company, and they would have golf courses, tennis courts, swimming pools, American clubs. It's kind of like how you see in American bases that you have like the food and all that is American.
Yeah,
This is how you'd
they're
have
eating
there.
burgers instead of gallo pinto.
And then you have the yellow zone, in which it's like at first it was Americans, but then it got into like being native population, and the native is in like Costa Ricans, because obviously there were still settlers. But yeah, so there was like Costa Rican managers instead of having American managers strictly.
Yeah,
And then you'd have the gray zone, in which was completely like sometimes you'd have issues with like showers and toilets, and you'd have to share. And one of the biggest issues was just that the company started doing having like losses, and because of the union movement, and because of like the country started to like do taxation, and like it did start to like crumble down just because of that, like extracting as much wealth and then not even bothering to bring any changes, like any changes to infrastructure. Infrastructure started being dated, after using it for so much time.
so tell me a little bit more about these unions, these banana worker unions.
I mean, I don't think banana worker unions were like the main thing. It was I think like the biggest union were like the shoemakers, for example. The shoemaker union was like very starkly like strong at that time. And this is something that you see in the United States too. Every legislation that tries to help the workers very conveniently gets rid of any access to farmers. And it happened here too, in which when the legislation was written to start creating social security and labor codes.
Well, we're definitely going to get into that as well. In particular, what's known in this country as the social guarantees that were brought upon by not by the person I think most people expect,
Yeah, not Figueres.
not Figueres, instead by a guy named Calderon Guardias. and he was not very he was not very political as a president. He had no ideology. He would at first, try and get the support of the right wing. They didn't really want to support him. They preferred to support the more liberal candidates, such as Figueres and friends. And instead, he garnered the support of the unions, in particular, as we mentioned, the plantation workers unions, both banana, pineapple, coffee, as well as more city type unions, as you mentioned, such as the shoemakers.
Yeah.
And all of these unions were under the banner of the PVP, not player versus player, but the Partido Vanguardia Popular, which is the Popular Vanguard Party, also known as the Communist Party of Costa Rica.
Yeah, it was kind of like used like at some point they were like the same, like, but they were a bit different. I don't know why like this type of name was like so used like both ways, like you know, Communist Party of Costa Rica and then like the PVP Vanguard, Popular Vanguard Party.
Yeah, and in this government there were a couple of famous, let's say, faces. One of them being Carlos Luis Fallas, author of Mamita Yunay and member of the PVP, as well as Manuel Mora Valverde. That's right,
Yeah.
Who was the leader of the PVP, and they were the main policymakers in the president's ear and in the Asamblea, the parliament, let's say. And it's because of them that we now, to this day, still have many of the social guarantees that were ratified after the Civil War, or re-ratified, let's say.
So what happens is that this creation was because of the Great Depression. Shocking. Great Depression creates radicalization because you can see that
Exactly.
like the working class all over the world starts struggling. So obviously they start doing strikes. So there were 3 great strikes in 2 years, in about like between 1932 to 1934 in San Jose, like 3 big strikes, and you can tell that like that really increased the political power of the labor organizers, one of which was the Communist Party. And then this prompts the government to create 9 separate laws to promote employment through public spending between 1931 and 1935. And they create a minimum wage, unemployment insurance, price control for the basic commodities.
Child rights.
Yeah. So, and this social guarantee, however, so this creates a nationalized health care system, helping retired workers, construction of low housing, just to try to help the workers. But there's obviously, as I mentioned, there's an exception of farm workers. So,
of course, the land-owning whites.
Yeah, so farms employing less than 5 workers, which employed approximately 74% of the agricultural workforce, were exempt from labor code provisions.
So, we could do a little bit of slavery, just not like a lot of slavery.
Yeah, so like
74% of the time.
as soon as you do that, even in the US, if you see a lot of overtime laws and all of those, there's the except agricultural workers. Like all of them have their written in, like, except.
That's how you get 12-year-old Guatemalans working in the fields of Alabama.
Yeah, like and it's like it's so sad because obviously food is the main thing for humans, and instead of being like the most respected industry or like the most respected work area, it becomes like the most exploited.
100%. But they will look for exploitation anywhere. And whatever the lowest barrier of entry to do the job will be the most exploited. Like if a kid can do it, oof, then you get ready to get exploited.
Yeah. But I just mean like how are the other workers able to get concessions, but like agricultural workers never get them?
Yeah,
Like where when they have the biggest leverage, if they don't work, there's literally no food.
I totally agree. So you
Like
need
if they,
Cesar Chavez type movements.
that's why like in US, for example, strike laws. In US, strike laws are lax for other areas, but if you strike in the agriculture sector, you get the fucking military at point blank about to shoot you.
Yeah, you're essentially forced back to work.
Yeah, at gunpoint.
Pretty much same happened with the trains as well. But anyways,
Yeah, that too. Like, but that's kind of like a right after the agriculture. It's
yeah,
like the infrastructure.
exactly.
So anyway, I wanted to mention that one other, and I would call it infiltration of the workers' movement, was by the Catholic Church.
Mhm.
And the Catholic Church had created a similar party that was part of the labor movement.
Mm.
Yes. So instead of the labor movement being completely on the hands of the Communist Party, it was also in the hands of the and it's called Costa Rican Catholic Church. And the party was Confederación Costarricense de Trabajadores Rerum Novarum. And it seems very weird that like there would be a Catholic church in the labor movement and they would be anti-communists because they were very staunchly anti-communists.
Yeah,
And
as many Catholics were. We can see the
the
same in Cuba.
and the leader himself or like the higher ranks of the party had studied in America and they had learned that anti-communism, but their idea of supporting the workers was this. They said, oh, we're not pro-capitalist, we're not pro-socialist, we're not pro anything, we're only pro-social change, we're pro-social justice. And them being pro-social justice meant that whoever had like the quote-unquote moral high ground at that time, they would be pro. And at
That's
that time,
really
workers
silly.
had, yeah, and at that time, the workers had the moral high ground because the capitalists were mistreating them. So they said, "Oh, we are pro-worker," because they're
Doesn't this
being,
go back to what we said regarding how a lot of the decision making from the populace before these labor movements was just based on gossip? And
yeah, it's
ultimately,
just
gossip is whoever is like the moral high ground of the gossip. That's it.
yeah, it's just vibes. Like I
Yeah.
think you are mistreating them, so they'll be pro, but like without any logical consistency, without any
Any
ideology.
framework. Yeah.
Yeah, ideological framework to ground yourself in the world and politics. So, and they end up having a very very bitter split in the labor movement. They being the Communist Party and
Yeah.
they would have like they'd have a protest and then they would have a counter protest from the other side, and they would say that the opponent is going to destroy the labor movement, which I think the Catholic Church did, the Catholic Church Party did. And here's the funnier part: the Communist Party accused the Catholic Church of getting money from capitalists, and you know it's said that there is evidence of them receiving money from capitalists.
Of course.
There was some evidence. So, and they started and you can see why, because they started siding with the opposition in the Civil War, which we'll talk about.
Yeah. So there is a civil war.
I
Go
can
ahead.
I can say like the start. So
Okay.
the Civil War, the preamble to it is basically there are some elections that the government rigs in favor of them against the opposition. So, but since the opposition starts becoming well funded and well organized, and part of that is capitalists do start to some capitalists do start to fund them and help them out. One of the main things one of the main reasons is because of a property tax that the government creates, property and income tax, in which it would be a progressive tax. You remember when I mentioned the person got cooed because of this? This government tries the same thing.
Exactly. So he placed property taxes. He started using those taxes for the social guarantees programs that we know to this day.
Specifically, one of the taxes, I think the income or the property, was to increase 15% all teacher salaries in the country, which was very popular. Everybody wanted that, but they just didn't want it like the rich just didn't want it with
Their money.
their money. Like everybody wanted, because education is important, but we just don't want to pay for it.
Yeah, and so
the opposition.
It was a very popular presidency to everyone but the landowners.
I'd say it was popular in those areas, but also because of the big corruption that Calderon had, and also his other I'm blanking on the name.
Michalski.
Yeah, Michalski, but he goes Picado.
Yeah,
he goes by middle name.
Yeah, Teodoro Picado Michalski.
Yeah, so Picado, which obviously had absolutely no base of support, and it was just dependent on the Communist Party. And basically, the government is not popular in the sense that there's so much corruption, but at the same time they do these good things enough to at least keep in power and have a base of support from the unions.
And also, at this time, they're doing these popular things, and the capitalists, wealthy class, land-owning class, begins to align with the Figueres side of the party. And eventually they put up a candidate, which is the center of all of this. And this guy is the owner of all of the means of communication. This is
I wanted to
Otilio Blanco.
I wanted to mention a tiny thing, interesting thing. One of the biggest issues that arose during World War II is Costa Rica was a bit dependent on the Axis powers, and there were a lot of Italian and German descent, people from Italian and German descent, even
Absolutely.
rich. So when Costa Rica declared,
this is the whitest country after all.
Yeah, and when Costa Rica sided with the Allies, and United States got all the trade that they were doing with Germany now ended up being on the trade with the United States. All of those descendants did immediately want to go side with the opposition. Yeah. Which is a very interesting thing, because the opposition also is getting help by the United States, because they're flaming the fans of communism during the Cold War.
Exactly.
And they're like, this government is basically nothing but just a communist-run government. Although there isn't a communist leader, there is so much support, and the Vanguard Party is very influential, which it was, but they were embellishing just to get more support.
Of course. But ultimately, they did pass the social guarantees. And so ultimately, this election happens, as well as other elections prior, and they've all been called rigged. They're all rigged. And let's say they are all rigged, but this last one was also openly rigged with the aid of the United States, as well as the owner of the means of communication. And this eventually leads to the opposition party starting a civil war. And they begin to use American weapons to try and take down the local government, as you mentioned, to coup them. And ultimately over very similar things that they had already couped them 100 years prior.
Yeah. And now an interesting thing is that the Costa Rican government is lacking a lot of weapons.
Almost non-existent.
Yeah. So what they try to do is they try to get weapons from the U.S. and the U.S. denies them
Yeah, they were
weapons.
already funding Figueres' side of the party, the liberals.
And then U.S. denies Mexico from selling them weapons, telling them, "Oh, you shouldn't interfere in another country because that's against the law." And then
Don't
when
interfere after we
Honduras,
already interfered.
yeah, and then when I think it was Guatemala or interferes on the side of the opposition, Figueres, the United States says nothing. Says nothing. But then when Somoza wants to help the government, the United States says something and says don't interfere. So like only the ones pro-government should not interfere. The ones that are helping the opposition, they're free. They're free to interfere and will, happily help the opposition.
Yeah, so eventually the opposition wins. They were more well funded and more well armed, and they win against essentially just the PvP militias, which were plantation workers, shoemakers, just workers who had organized into militias and tried to protect the state. They lost, and the deal that they came to, Manuel Mora Valverde and Figueres, was that they had to keep the social guarantees, and he would cede power to Figueres.
Yep.
And they agreed, and that's the deal that they came to this day. Obviously, that's not the only thing that happened. As soon as they signed the treaty, he very soon after killed, dozens of communists, the Figueres government. He also exiled Manuel Mora Valverde to Mexico. He also banned the PvP from participating in government for the next roughly 30 years. And he eventually instituted the same liberal policies of allowing particularly U.S. corporations to continue to control the country, as you said, capture.
Yeah. And
One brief thing that I will mention is something we haven't necessarily mentioned, but has been present in all of the things we've been saying. And that is that every time a president is couped or a treaty is signed, the legitimacy of that treaty and the legitimacy of that president comes directly from the United States. Whether it is the United States, in the 1800s approving annexation treaties and saying this is legitimate, or the United States government saying, yes, Figueres is the real candidate, or even the US government saying the same of at least 3 other candidates in the past.
Yeah, like for example, one of the reasons why it is stated that the United States interfered was by immediately, as soon as as soon as the opposition got arms and started marching into the capital, started creating the battlefronts and started to fight to get into the capital, the United States immediately started getting the government to make a deal. And every time they would try to make a deal, the government would say, the United States would say that the government shouldn't ask much, and then always would try to forcibly get the government to accept the opposition's demands. So it's not. It's basically it comes at the hands of what the US preferred, and they obviously preferred Figueres, which is why it's thought that this is the first intervention of Cold War in Americas, and it's not Guatemala.
Yeah, and in fact, it would be correct if not for the fact that it was a communist government, except for exactly the president, basically.
Yeah, but even if you even think about it, because they kept saying, "Oh my God, Moscow will be is in the Americas because of Costa Rica and all that." Mora wasn't a Leninist, although the Americans made him out to be. He was a democratic socialist. He was not ideologically the same as the USSR.
No, not at all. And I think that's a perfect segue to something that has been ever present as well, and something to keep in mind for the upcoming topics. And it's that, as a American said in the 19th century, the Costa Rican politician has no ideology. The only ideology he has is the enrichment of himself and his family and friends. But he is not ideological. So it doesn't matter who wins. It doesn't matter if party A wins or party B wins. There will always be someone we can work with because they don't have an ideology that will run counter to ours, which is just giving them money, which is ultimately the only thing they want.
And I guess this was the most ideological period. And even this wasn't really as much compared to, like, if you take other countries, like, as I said, like,
Nicaragua.
Yeah, you can say that, like, compared to that, or, like, other, other countries, like, Afghanistan and all that, which we mentioned.
Grenada.
Yeah. So, like, even more, for example, like, because you can see it, what he has said. He has said, "Oh, we're not a party, although called Vanguard Party, by the way. We're not a party that will take the country by revolution. We'll do it by reform."
Yeah.
Which is kind of the opposite of what the name represents. But yeah, this was very soft in the ideological sense compared to other countries, but this was the biggest point of
but it was
ideology.
100% agree, and it was a really big point in the history of Costa Rica as well, because being the whitest, landowningest, most indigenous population genocidist country in the region, the superior race region of pure, unfettered status quo exploitation, it was a really big deal. Like, even though, you say it was very light, this was a very big deal for Costa Rica. And in fact, the outcome of that is still celebrated to this day and seen in the country as the highest point of the nation, even though they associate it with Figueres instead of associating it with Mora Valverde.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I see that. I'm just comparing it to the tumultuous times of other countries.
Of course.
Having to fight revolutions and civil wars that have killed millions. Compared to that, this wasn't
No, it was very chill. It wasn't even like a year-long war. It was like a few days.
Yeah,
it was like a month and a half. But anyways, so we have the Civil War. It ends. Social guarantees. Figueres becomes president. History is written by the victors. And then what happens? Then we have a long line from the 40s all the way till 2024. I would say roughly the same candidate over and over again with minor differences.
Yeah, it's basically whatever was before the 1900s. Early 1900s, like from the creation up until 1900s was similarly to that, in which it was basically just one candidate, and you'd win by just bribing people and doing fraud, and you'd put your friends in power. It kind of happens like.
And then you keep selling out to whatever the big U.S. corporation of the time is.
Yeah.
Of course, some candidates have some minor differences. Some names that usually stand out are, of course, Figueres himself, as well as Oscar Arias. Both instituted very similar neoliberal policies that have worsened the country by privatizing everything from the highways to everything, like complete entire swaths of land for plantations, as the United Fruit Company continued to operate to this day.
And the funniest thing is when U.S. magazines or like newspapers start cooking you. It's like it's you do their bidding, your friends, your ally with US, and then they still like start telling you that you're like not really a good leader.
Yeah. And it's it's pretty pathetic, I would say. And if you're a good boy, maybe they'll give you a Nobel Peace Prize so you can, be in good company with Henry Kissinger and Barack Obama and An Suu Kim and whatever.
Yeah,
So and also I believe he won the Nobel Peace Prize for peace in Central America, which very interesting to give a Nobel Peace Prize to someone from Costa Rica when ultimately peace in Central America is dependent on U.S. foreign policy. It certainly didn't make El Salvador safer, or Guatemala, or Honduras.
and also these, because I read somewhere where Costa Rica has become, because they have like increased into having non-food, like not necessary food products, we're making them having to import rice
Yep.
and other products. So like they're food insecure, although they produce food because they're producing like trying to produce bananas and coffee, which obviously you're not going to live off.
You're not going to live off banana, coffee, and a pineapple. Yeah.
So,
And it's and the populace has not changed so much, even from the previous analysis of vibes and gossip. This takes into account that Costa Rica has one of the lowest voter participations in the world, especially for an OECD nation. And
very low.
yeah, very, very low. And
I mean,
this country still, to this day, suffers, slowly, similar to Europe, very slowly, year after year of neoliberal policies. But every year it gets worse. And that's how you end up with large infrastructure problems. Like, for example, the main bridge of this country that connects one side of the Gulf to the other. Well, that bridge never received maintenance, ever. And so now they need to shut down the bridge to give it maintenance. But because they haven't given it maintenance in forever, it's going to be like a while. And because there was no infrastructure projects to account for it, now there is no passage from one side of the Gulf to the other. Which is insane, because that is the primary form of transportation for all the communities that live in, particularly in Punta Arenas, is the name of the region. And, and this is not the only case. It's full of infrastructure problems like this. The main highways in the country, the main highways in the capital are privatized and owned by foreign corporations, Spanish in particular. And they just charge the government whatever they want. And the government, finalize contracts with them. But even if they finalize contracts, the company says, no, you still have to pay us some more, actually. And the government can't even expropriate these literal public goods, public works, and instead just concedes to the companies, because ultimately that is the policy of that might even be the only ideology of the politicians in this country. I have a couple things I have left now that we've kind of got into the modern times. One is COVID, which Costa Rica had the best response to in all of the Americas, including Canada and the United States. So I will say that was commendable. And the other thing is that currently there is a social divide with regards to elections. And that social divide is usually the way elections go is the only region that matters in the vote is the metropolitan area, which is the central area of the country, which is San Jose, Cartago, Alajuela, Heredia. And you capture that and you've won every election. And so what that means is that the coasts forever get abandoned and ignored. And the only investment is in the central area. And not just the coasts, but there is a social divide as well in religion. So Costa Rica, we may not have mentioned, but it is constitutionally a Christian nation. It is a theocratic nation, unlike most countries in the world, of course. And they are explicitly a Christian nation, which traditionally has been Catholic, as all of Latin America, but in recent years, similar to the rest of Latin America, has become increasingly evangelical. What that means is that in the last few elections, for example, in the not this current presidency, but the previous one, that election was over LGBT rights, but particularly also over a Catholic candidate versus an evangelical candidate. And in that case, the Catholic candidate won because the country was still primarily Catholic. The evangelicals, who primarily are in the poorest populations, as we mentioned, the Catholic Church has usually been associated in Latin America with the rich, wealthy, white Spanish elites because they formed a part of the white supremacist colonialist movement in the Americas alongside the conquistadors. The evangelical religion has spread very quickly across poor populations and especially marginalized populations along the coasts. So that's, I would say, an interesting, relevant divide in the present day. Having said that, both candidates, and not both, because in these more recent elections, there were like 20 candidates, and all 20 candidates were either liberal, like neoliberals, or straight conservative, and about half of the parties were explicitly Christian parties. So that is the current state of politics in the country.
And I wanted to mention two things. One of I wanted to find, because I was reading an article in the newspaper, the university newspaper, from a professor, and he mentions that the country has never reached such a cruel Gini coefficient, 0.52, which was very bad because the Latin American average is 0.469, so it's almost
illustrate our chatters with what the Gini coefficient is, and also when you say the university, I assume you mean the University of Costa Rica.
Yeah, the University of Costa Rica.
It's just illuminate us.
It's representing inequality, income inequality.
Yeah.
Specifically, and I was shocked to have it so bad. And also he also mentions right after that the top 1% in the world own as much as the remaining 99%, which is that goes to show how much thing. And obviously blames the PLN for this,
which is the main party, the party of Figueres, in fact.
Yeah, and blames Figueres for this exacerbation of inequality in the country. And the other thing that is so interesting, because it really shocked me, is if you go to the OECD and go to data and try to find hours worked, which is total hours per worker in the country.
Don't get me started.
You have Germany, which is the lowest in the OECD. It's 1341 per worker, 1,341 hours, which is
per year.
Yeah, per year, which is extremely low.
No, it's good. What do you mean extremely low? It's good.
For compared to others, it's very low. Let's see.
It's what everyone should strive for, if not better.
Yes. Yeah, I agree with that. It's 33 and a half weeks of full time in the year.
All right, now give me Costa Rica. Keeping in mind, I believe the only country worse than Costa Rica is Mexico.
We'll see.
Of OECD nations.
You have Japan at 1,607, which is very low, and I reckon because this is an average and it's actually the mean out of the average. I'm not sure, but I'm guessing it's the mean. Japan will have people that work extremely hard, but the ones that work too little will average it out at 1,607. Mm-hmm. Then you have Canada, which is at 1,686. The OECD average is at 1,752 for all the workers in OECD. United States works very hard, 1,800.
Works very hard. What a stupid way to put it.
Yeah. Very hard workers.
Uh-huh.
And
Germany,
then you go,
famously, the Germans, very lazy workers.
dude, they're lazy as fuck. They gotta get
Uh-huh.
those hours
Okay,
done.
okay.
What are they
So
doing?
where's Costa Rica? Come on, hit me with it.
You have Korea, which with its horrible, worker practices, it's at 1,901. And then Costa Rica is at top three at 2,149 hours
Let's
per
go. And
work.
now look at the income of these different workers. Do you think the German worker is making on average more or less, working less hours than the Costa Rican worker?
Add to that 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 number for Costa Rica, if you divide it by 40, which is per week, right?
Mm-hmm.
For a full time, you'd end up with 53.725. So almost every single week worked full time in the year.
Yeah, that's how it is.
You'd average it out for every single worker. And obviously there are workers who work extremely hard, more than that, because this is an average.
Yeah.
And Mexico is right after that, which with a bit more,
Mm-hmm.
2,226, and then Colombia, which is the number one with
Really, Colombia? I was
2,400.
shocked. Well, there you go.
2,400
Well, then there you go.
hours.
There you go, and there you have it. That means
Like,
Peru is doing better than us. That means El Salvador is doing better.
yeah.
Guatemala is doing better. Nicaragua is doing better.
I feel like I really do wonder, because in the social guarantees there was never a mention of overtime and all that stuff. I wonder how that got resolved, or it never did.
I mean, already just property taxes got people murdered. Now imagine
Yeah,
they started talking about overtime. Another there's a few good points of research, I would say. Everything from like what you just mentioned to Knights of the Golden Circle to the Vanderbilt Morgan rivalry and how that impacted Costa Rica. Um, even
yeah,
even to just like the social practices in indigenous communities, like 20 cocoa beans for a prostitute. Is that expensive or is that cheap? I still don't know.
maybe in the middle.
Maybe it was reasonably priced. But I will
Anyway,
say the main note I wanted to end on, beyond everything else we've said, is that in doing this research, we had to look at a lot of sources. We had to look at what are the Spanish saying, what are the British saying, what are the Americans saying, what are the Costa Ricans saying, what are the Nicaraguans saying, what is William Walker saying, what is the the Spanish monk saying, what is the conquistador saying, what is etc. And something that I really noticed is that in American and Costa Rican history textbooks, there is a glaring lack of materialist analysis where they will simply gloss over important, relevant topics or simply explain it away in a silly way. So, for example, they will say things like, William Walker was motivated by manifest destiny, period. Without mentioning any of the financial reasons why he was doing what he was doing, political reasons why he was doing what he was doing. It's not like he wasn't literally aligned with the senator of Louisiana, for example. But it's much easier, I think, to hand wave away and provide an analysis that is not based on tangible things when you are trying to follow a narrative. And I think when we started, we didn't have any idea of what we were going to find. We didn't want to kind of create a narrative until we had started doing research already. So it's based on the facts rather than on what our preconceived notions may or may not have been. And so just suffice it to say that you got to be really careful when you are quoting from sources that are just translations of American sources and these American sources have a bias, a very clear bias. Ultimately, I had a lot of fun researching this.
Yeah, I mean, everything has bias. You just have to, you know, understand that
Yeah.
and move into seeing what, what, fits for you if you think a certain way. Obviously, for example, I can say that there were a few articles that I read that were like trying to challenge in the civil, like materialist analysis of the Civil War, and trying to challenge that. Oh, it was the capitalist class that was doing that, or there were articles that were saying, oh, the Americans had no intervention, right? And they gave their own, uh, you know, evidence. And in fact, those were the first things that I read. So I thought, oh, okay, maybe there was no intervention. Like, hey,
Hmm.
maybe this one wasn't America really intervening because it was so early in the Cold War. They weren't really ready for it. Obviously, they had started intervening because I know from my country that they had already started intervening in other countries, CIA. But I thought, oh, maybe this was a one-off. Like they didn't bother, and they had already Figueres had this, done on its own. And then you kind of realize that, oh, those those were pretty big stretch. And I think the if you read the ones who talk about the Civil War, they mostly will be from the idea of there being a capitalist.
Yes, they are usually pro Figueres.
But like the historians, they do establish it in the sense that, yeah, I mean, like there were capitalists that were very enraged by the government's actions of the labor. Even if
Hmm.
there were some capitalists that weren't,
Hmm.
they were fine. But obviously there were some that really, funded Figueres just to how to get rid of that property tax, get rid of, you know, the labor code, and etc. etc.
Yeah, so hopefully, people will kind of see this country with a little bit more depth rather than just like the beach with a sloth drinking a cocktail, surfing, I don't know, in like a zip line jungle sort of deal. Pura
Yeah.
vida. It's a lot more than that.